The engine roared, gravel scattered, and within seconds the ATV was gone. Ethan stood frozen in the middle of his driveway, staring at the empty space where his bright red ATV had been parked just moments earlier. But the most shocking part wasn't that it was taken, it was who took it. Across the street, the HOA president's daughter had just driven away like she owned the place. She didn't even glance back, and that was the moment Ethan realized something strange was happening in his quiet neighborhood. What made the situation worse was the confidence on her face. She didn't sneak. She didn't hide. She simply walked up, started the ATV, and drove off like it was her property. Neighbors standing nearby exchanged awkward looks but said nothing, because everyone knew exactly who her mother was, Karen Whitmore, the powerful and outspoken president of the neighborhood HOA. For years she had controlled every rule, every fine, every meeting. People avoided conflict with her the same way they avoided thunderstorms. Ethan had only moved into the neighborhood 3 months earlier. He didn't understand the silent rules yet, but he was about to learn them very quickly. At first he thought maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe her daughter believed it belonged to someone else. Still, something about the situation didn't feel accidental, it felt deliberate. And Ethan had a strange feeling this moment was about to start a chain reaction no one in the neighborhood would forget, because the person who took that ATV had no idea Ethan had already prepared for something like this, and what he had waiting would soon change everything. 10 minutes after the ATV disappeared, Ethan calmly walked back inside his house. He didn't panic, he didn't run after it. Instead, he opened his laptop and pulled up something very specific: security cameras. When Ethan bought the house, he had installed a full camera system around the property. Front yard, driveway, garage, even the side path near the trees, every angle was recorded, and now the footage was playing clearly on his screen. There she was, Karen's daughter, Madison, walking straight onto his property with complete confidence. She looked around for barely a second before grabbing the ATV keys from the hook near the garage door. Then she started the engine. The video captured everything. Ethan leaned back in his chair and sighed slowly. The entire event lasted less than 30 seconds. No hesitation, no fear, just the behavior of someone who believed nothing would happen to them. But what made Ethan pause wasn't the theft itself, it was the reaction he expected next. Because if Madison had taken the ATV, it meant Karen probably knew about it, and in this neighborhood, that meant things were about to become complicated. Most residents had learned the same lesson over the years: if Karen wanted something, she usually got it. Still, Ethan wasn't like most residents. He saved the video file carefully and placed it in a folder labeled with the date. Then he stood up, looked out his window toward Karen's large house across the street, and quietly smiled, because he had a feeling the story wasn't ending today. In fact, this might only be the opening scene. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked across the street and knocked on Karen Whitmore's front door. He didn't bring anger with him, just a calm expression. After a moment, the door opened and Karen appeared, wearing her usual confident smile. She held a clipboard like she always did during HOA inspections. "Oh, you must be Ethan," she said casually. Her tone sounded friendly, but Ethan noticed something in her eyes. It was the look of someone who already knew why he was there. "I think your daughter took my ATV earlier today," Ethan said calmly. Karen's smile didn't disappear. Instead, it grew slightly wider. "Oh, that," she said with a small laugh. "Madison mentioned borrowing something from your yard." Borrowing, the word hung in the air like a strange echo. Ethan blinked slowly. "She didn't ask," he replied. Karen crossed her arms. "Well, in this community we try to share things. It builds neighborhood spirit." Ethan almost laughed, but Karen continued before he could speak again. "Besides," she added, glancing toward his driveway, "that ATV has been sitting outside for weeks. It looked unused." That was the moment Ethan realized something important. Karen truly believed she could decide what happened on other people's property, and judging by her relaxed attitude, she expected Ethan to accept it quietly. But Ethan simply nodded. "All right," he said calmly. Karen looked slightly surprised by how quickly he agreed. What she didn't realize was that Ethan wasn't finished, because the next step in this story would reveal something that neither Karen nor her daughter had expected, and when it happened, the entire neighborhood would finally see the truth. That evening, the sound of the ATV returned to the street. Madison rode it back into Ethan's driveway like nothing unusual had happened. She parked it casually, stepped off, and walked away without even knocking on the door. Ethan watched the entire moment through his window, still calm, still silent. Neighbors walking their dogs slowed down, clearly curious about what was happening. Everyone had seen Madison riding the ATV earlier, and everyone expected some kind of confrontation. But Ethan didn't step outside. Instead, he waited. Because he understood something many people didn't. Sometimes the most powerful move is Patience, about an hour later, the neighborhood HOA group chat suddenly became active. Messages appeared one after another. Someone had posted a short video clip. The footage showed Madison clearly driving the ATV away from Ethan's driveway earlier that day. The angle was perfect. The timestamp was visible. Within minutes, dozens of residents were watching it. Questions began appearing in the chat. Was this taken without permission? Did she really just take it? Karen tried to respond quickly. She wrote that it was simply a misunderstanding, but the video kept spreading. Neighbors began talking, whispering, questioning. For the first time in years, Karen's authority inside the community looked uncertain, and Ethan knew something important had just changed. The truth had finally entered the conversation, but the biggest twist in this story hadn't even happened yet, because what Ethan planned to do next would leave the entire HOA completely speechless. The next morning, the neighborhood meeting room was packed. Karen had called an emergency HOA meeting, claiming the situation needed to be clarified. Residents filled every chair, whispering quietly. Ethan arrived last. He sat calmly in the back of the room. Karen stood at the front with her usual confident posture. This issue has been exaggerated online, she began, gesturing toward the group chat discussions. She explained that Madison had only borrowed the ATV briefly. She insisted it was a misunderstanding that didn't require drama. For a moment, some residents seemed unsure. Then Ethan slowly raised his hand. Karen hesitated. Before allowing him to speak, he stood up calmly and walked toward the front table. I agree, Ethan said politely. Misunderstandings happen. Karen looked relieved, but Ethan placed a small folder on the table. Inside were printed screenshots from his security cameras, multiple angles, clear timestamps, and something even more important, a short clip showing Madison taking the keys directly from his property without asking. The room became very quiet. Karen stared at the images. Her confident expression began to fade. Because the evidence didn't leave room for interpretation, residents looked at one another with growing realization. For years Karen had controlled the narrative in the neighborhood, but this time, the story was written in undeniable proof. And that proof had just changed everything. Within hours of the meeting, the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt completely different. Residents who once stayed silent were now asking questions, not just about the ATV incident, about everything. People began discussing past fines, strange HOA decisions, and moments when Karen's authority had seemed unfair. For the first time, the balance of power was shifting. Ethan didn't need to argue. He didn't need to accuse anyone. The truth was already visible. Later that evening, a small group of residents gathered outside near the mailboxes. They spoke quietly but confidently. Someone suggested a review of HOA leadership. Another neighbor mentioned that new elections might be necessary. Word traveled quickly through the community. Karen's position, once untouchable, suddenly looked fragile. Meanwhile, Madison avoided leaving her house. The ATV sat peacefully in Ethan's driveway again, but it had become more than just a vehicle. It had become a symbol, a moment where someone finally stood calmly against a system that many residents had quietly feared. And now the neighborhood was starting to realize something powerful. Respect isn't built by control, it's built by fairness. But the story still had one final twist waiting. Because what happened at the next HOA meeting would bring this entire situation to an unforgettable conclusion. 1 week later, the HOA held another official meeting. This time the mood was very different. Residents arrived early, conversations were open, the quiet tension that had filled the neighborhood for years seemed to be lifting. Karen stood at the front of the room again, but her confident energy had faded. When the meeting began, several residents politely requested a vote to review HOA leadership policies. The request followed the community bylaws exactly. No arguments, no anger, just procedure. The vote happened quickly, one by one. Hands rose across the room. By the time it ended, the result was clear. The community wanted change. Karen stepped down from her position shortly afterward. There were no dramatic arguments, no loud speeches, just a quiet understanding that the neighborhood had moved in a new direction. Outside, Ethan walked back toward his house as the evening sun faded behind the trees. His ATV sat exactly where it belonged. Neighbors waved as he passed. The neighborhood felt different now, more open, more balanced. Sometimes the biggest changes don't begin with anger or confrontation. Sometimes they begin with a single moment where someone calmly chooses to stand for what's right. And that was the moment that changed everything in this neighborhood. And that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.